In a hypothetical scene that feels like it was written by someone who binged C-SPAN the way other people binge crime dramas, Speaker Mike Johnson leans into his microphone and aims a question straight at Representative Ilhan Omar. He doesn't shout, he doesn't smirk, he doesn't perform for the cameras, at least not in the obvious way. He asks it like a professor calling on a student who didn't read the assignment, calm enough to sound almost polite. Congresswoman Omar, if the United States and Somalia went to war, hypothetically, which side would you want to win? And in that moment, the room stops breathing. The silence isn't the quick pause you expect before a politician pivots to a talking point. It's the long, uncomfortable kind that makes everyone suddenly aware of their own blinking, the kind where you can hear paper shift and chairs creak and somebody's cough die in their throat. Ilhan Omar sits at the witness table with her attorney beside her, folders stacked like props in a courtroom set. She's been answering questions for hours, but this one lands differently because it's not really a policy question. It's a loyalty test dressed up as a civics quiz. C-SPAN cameras, in this imagined setup, don't need commentary because the camera loves hesitation. It catches the micro-expressions, the quick glance to counsel, the hands tightening at the table edge like the table might float away. It catches her mouth opening, then closing, then opening again, as if the words are stuck somewhere between thought and consequence. 10 seconds becomes 20, 20 becomes 40, and now the silence is its own headline. The longer it goes, the more the audience begins to treat the silence as an answer, even if it isn't one. The room, as the story frames it, is packed beyond normal congressional crowded. Every seat taken, press spilling into the aisles, members lingering in the back, because the rumor mill promised something big. There's that peculiar Washington electricity where everybody acts like they're above drama, while showing up specifically for drama. Johnson is at the head of the dais, hands folded on top of a binder thick enough to qualify as furniture. Behind him are poster boards with charts and timelines, the kind that suggest somebody spent months with a highlighter and a grudge. To the right sit counsel and investigators, faces neutral, posture rigid, trying to look like professionals instead of participants. To the left, the narrative places empty chairs because Democrats boycotted, a detail that makes the hearing look less like debate and more like indictment. Omar wears a bright turquoise hijab and a dark blazer, styled for cameras the way every public figure styles for cameras. In this version, she expected a familiar script, sharp questions, predictable insinuations, a defiant speech, then a fundraising surge. She's survived harsh criticism before, and survival has a way of teaching you the wrong lesson, that everything is survivable. But the mood here is different because Johnson doesn't act like a cable host chasing a clip. He acts like a lawyer who doesn't need a clip because he thinks he already has one. After the minute-long silence, he doesn't raise his voice. He lowers it, which is usually worse. He says he'll rephrase to make the question simpler, and the room understands that simpler means harder to dodge. He points to the citizenship oath, renouncing other allegiances, and asks whether she meant it or whether she was lying. That's where the hypothetical scene starts playing its most dangerous game, turning identity into insinuation without saying it out loud. Omar's lawyer, named David Brennan in your draft, leans in and whispers like a man trying to stop a car from hitting a wall. Omar whispers back, and microphones catch the existence of the whisper without catching the words, which is perfect for speculation. Johnson waits like someone who believes waiting is part of the evidence. When Omar finally speaks, she calls it a loaded question, and Johnson replies that it's only loaded if honesty is difficult. Then the script sharpens its edge with an interpretation that's framed as inference. Johnson tells the room the silence tells us everything we need to know. He claims, in this story, that 6 hours of material already presented shows Somalia's interests, coordination, and money. But notice the phrasing matters. If this were narrated responsibly, it wouldn't declare those claims as settled facts. It would say Johnson argued or suggested or presented what he described as evidence. Because the minute a narrator states those things as real, you've left commentary and entered assertion. So the safer version keeps the focus on what was said in the room, not what is true in the world. Omar, in the scene, pops up from her chair, angry and cornered, calling it a witch hunt and Islamophobia disguised as oversight. Johnson's expression, as described, doesn't change, which is exactly the kind of detail a political narrator loves because it paints him as controlled and her as reactive. He tells her to sit down, she refuses, and suddenly the room feels like it's wobbling between hearing and spectacle. The sergeant-at-arms appears in the peripheral vision like a reminder that this isn't a podcast argument. She sits, not because she agrees, but because the rules of the room are bigger than the emotions inside it. Now the hearing turns from the loyalty question into the binder, because binders are how Washington tries to turn suspicion into legitimacy. Johnson holds up what he calls an NSA transcript and reads a quote attributed to Omar. "I will always prioritize Somalia's interests. America is just where I work." In any careful retelling, you'd treat that as claimed evidence rather than proven fact, because the audience cannot verify it. But the scene is written for impact, and impact loves certainty, so the quote hangs in the air like smoke. The room reacts, people gasp, reporters type, and someone blurts, "Traitor," a word that turns analysis into mob energy in half a second. Johnson then promises to spend the next hour showing who funded her, who she coordinated with, and what she said privately versus publicly. That framing matters because it tells the audience what to feel before they've heard anything else. It's the legal-style version of stick around after the break, except the break is your career. And then the narrator pulls the classic rewind. To understand how we got here, you have to go back 8 hours earlier. That's how political storytelling works now. Everything is a thriller if you pace it like a thriller. So the script jumps back to Omar's morning, her team, her preparation. She scrolls social media, sees hashtags, sees defenders flooding the zone, and assumes this is another cycle of outrage and counter-outrage. Her lawyer calls it broad, routine, a fishing expedition, something you stonewall until it dies in committee. Her chief of staff talks about framing. If they bring up Somalia, you call it an attack on refugee advocacy. If they bring up money, you say compliance. If they bring up positions, you say speech. Omar nods, believing the familiar playbook will work, because the familiar playbook usually does. Meanwhile, the story cuts to Mike Johnson preparing like a prosecutor. He's portrayed as meticulous, constitutional lawyer precise, with a former federal prosecutor type, Tom Emerson in your draft, walking him through the sequence. This is where the script gets loaded with claims, FAR violations, traced donations, intercepted calls, declassified snippets, a perfect voting correlation, witnesses with recordings. A responsible narrator would add distance everywhere. What Johnson's team claimed, what investigators alleged, what the binder asserted, what the timeline suggested. Because otherwise, the story becomes a direct allegation of criminal conduct by real people, delivered as entertainment, which is where narratives tend to go sideways. The hearing begins at 10 a.m. in the script, and Omar delivers an opening statement built for television. She calls it persecution, says she's being targeted for identity and criticism of U.S. foreign policy, recounts refugee background, emphasizes constituent service. It's a familiar rhetorical structure. Turn the proceeding into a referendum on motives rather than details. Her supporters applaud. Johnson calls for order, and she sits down believing she has seized the narrative. Then Johnson opens the binder and says, essentially, "Thank you. Now, let's talk about the paperwork." From here, the story presents financial charts and flow diagrams, tracing campaign donations through organizations with alleged foreign ties. Johnson asks whether Omar knew, whether she disclosed, whether she vetted, and her lawyer objects that the donors were U.S. entities following FEC rules. Johnson counters with what he describes as suspicious money flows and government-linked banking relationships, making insinuation look like accounting. He pivots to a spouse's consulting income, describing it as vague and conveniently timed, and he calls it corruption in the scene. Even in a fictionalized commentary, a careful narrator would frame that as Johnson's characterization, not a proven conclusion. Next, the script moves to communications. FISA warrants, NSA intercepts, numbers like 127 contacts and 43 policy-related communications. Those numbers function like a drumbeat, specific enough to sound real, hard to disprove quickly, memorable enough to repeat. Johnson reads lines from transcripts and offers to play audio, and the audio is described as crystal clear because clarity equals credibility in the audience's mind. He then links those communications to votes, building a pattern argument. Call, then vote, then payment, then vote. Repeat. This is the narrative's main weapon, not one smoking gun, but a wall of coincidence stacked until coincidence feels impossible. Then come the witnesses, Somali-American constituents, framed as Democrats, framed as former supporters, framed as reluctant truth-tellers. One plays a recording, said to be legal under Minnesota's one-party consent rule, capturing Omar speaking about identity and loyalty. Again, in a responsible retelling, you'd say, the witness claimed the recording captured Omar. The committee treated it as authentic. Omar disputed context. Because authenticity is the whole ballgame, and audiences deserve the difference between presented and proven. But the script is built for momentum, and momentum doesn't like disclaimers. After witnesses, Johnson returns to the citizenship oath and reads it like scripture, emphasizing absolutely and entirely renounce, and without mental reservation. He suggests that her private statements contradict the oath, implying a form of fraud without needing to say the word repeatedly. The scene tightens. Omar is exhausted, her defenses boxed in, and now the narrative wants the final gotcha moment. Johnson asks the war question again, and the script insists that any answer is fatal. America contradicts the alleged transcripts. Somalia contradicts the oath. Silence becomes confession. This is the trap, and the script wants the audience to feel that she stepped into it willingly. Omar tries to call it an absurd hypothetical, and Johnson says it's the most basic loyalty question there is. She calls it racist, he calls the accusation a dodge, and he frames her refusal as evidence that she can't answer honestly. She stands, he threatens removal, she sits, and he announces referrals to DOJ, Ethics, ODNI, USCIS, and the House for expulsion. In a dramatization, that's the climax. The binder becomes a gavel, procedure becomes punishment, and the camera lingers on her face as the room empties. Then the script rushes to the montage of consequences, clips viral, headlines everywhere, polling shifts, allies distance, special election, legal jeopardy. Here's where a careful American-style narrator can keep the tension without convicting anyone in the storytelling voice. You don't have to declare that Ilhan Omar did any of it. You only have to show how an institution can frame it, how a question can be engineered, how a room can be staged to make silence look like guilt. You can ask whether a loyalty question is fair or manipulative, whether it clarifies anything or just inflames instincts. You can ask what it means to be an immigrant, elected official in a country. You can also ask what it means for the Speaker of the House to behave like a prosecutor, and whether that's oversight or theater in a suit. Because the deeper hook isn't, "Did she do it?" not in a responsible commentary voice. The deeper hook is the system. How fast a narrative hardens when it's wrapped in charts. How easily, "I'm just asking questions," turns into a verdict. How quickly an audience confuses confidence with proof. It's the way empty chairs change the optics. The way a single hypothetical can be framed as a patriotism exam. The way a minute of silence becomes a permanent loop. It's the way a politician's strongest shield, identity, moral certainty, the assumption of bad faith from opponents, can suddenly become the very thing opponents use to say, "See, she won't even answer." And it's the way the public, starved for certainty, will often accept a neat story over a complicated truth. So in the final beat of this rewritten, hypothetical narrative, the punch isn't "she's guilty," because that's not commentary, that's a claim. The punch is that the clip plays anyway, and clips don't come with footnotes. A minute of silence becomes a shorthand for 1,000 arguments, and the public starts using it like a Rorschach test. You see in it whatever you already believed. Some people see persecution, some see accountability, some see a setup so obvious it's almost funny, and some see a question they wish nobody had asked because it reduces citizenship to a soundbite. And that's the real ending, the one that sticks. In modern politics, it's not the answer that breaks you. It's the moment when the room decides you can't afford one. And once that clip exists, it doesn't matter how many lawyers show up afterward with context, footnotes, and a calm voice. A minute of silence is visual, and visuals don't care about nuance. They care about hesitation, about the tiny flicker in someone's eyes that looks like calculation, even if it's just fatigue. They care about how Mike Johnson looks when he asks the question, and how Ilhan Omar looks when she doesn't answer it. In Washington, perception isn't just reality, it's the receipt people pass around when they don't have the full story. So the hearing moves on, and everyone pretends they're still in fact-finding mode, even as the room starts acting like it already found what it came for. Johnson doesn't need to raise his voice anymore, because the atmosphere does it for him. He flips to the next tab in the binder, the way a magician flips to the next card. Except, this isn't a magic trick. It's paperwork. He asks about disclosures, meetings, communications, and timing, and every question is framed like a door with only one safe exit. And Omar's lawyer keeps doing what lawyers do: objecting, narrowing, asking for precision, while knowing precision rarely wins a political room. Omar tries to regain ground by returning to theme instead of detail. She talks about constituents, immigrant families, people caught between governments, the reality that diaspora communities don't stop loving their birthplace just because they love America too. She frames herself as someone who understands two worlds, not someone who belongs to one and betrays the other. And if you're being honest, that argument lands with a lot of people because it describes a common human experience. But the hearing isn't really about humanity. It's about framing, and the frame that day is built to make complexity look like evasiveness. Johnson, in this hypothetical, keeps coming back to the same move. Take something normal, describe it in the most suspicious way possible, then ask why it isn't suspicious. A call becomes coordination. A meeting becomes conduit. A donation becomes pipeline. A vote becomes instruction. It's a rhetorical style that doesn't require proving intent because it implies intent so aggressively that the audience supplies it for you. And if you challenge the implication, you risk sounding like you're defending something you haven't even seen. That's the trap of modern oversight. The strongest accusation is the one that never fully states itself. This is where I'd pause, if I were narrating this as commentary, and ask the uncomfortable question nobody likes. What is this hearing supposed to accomplish? Clarity, accountability, or a clip that makes a person radioactive? Because those are three different missions, and Washington loves pretending they're the same thing. If the goal is clarity, you slow down. You release verifiable facts. You let independent scrutiny do its job. If the goal is accountability, you follow the process like a grown-up, even when it's boring, even when it's inconvenient. But if the goal is a clip, then you don't want the story to be solvable. You want it to feel solvable while keeping enough fog in place that the argument can live forever. You want supporters to say, they never proved anything, and critics to say, she never denied it. And you want both sides to keep showing up. You want to turn politics into a subscription service with weekly episodes and never-ending cliffhangers. And nothing sells like a loyalty question, because loyalty is one of the few things Americans still treat like religion. The hearing room audience reacts in predictable waves. Some people nod along as if they're watching a long overdue correction. Some people stiffen as if they're watching a familiar kind of targeting, just packaged with better fonts and more solemn faces. Reporters don't cheer, but you can tell when they sense a headline because their fingers start moving faster. Staffers exchange looks that say, "This is going to change the next 3 months of our lives." And Omar, sitting there, has to decide whether she's fighting the questions, the narrative, or the inevitability of being outframed. At some point, even the sharpest politician realizes a hearing isn't a conversation. It's a one-way performance where the person with the gavel controls the rhythm, the breaks, and the emotional temperature of the room. Johnson can pause for effect. Omar's pauses look like fear. Johnson can rephrase. Omar's rephrasing looks like dodging. Johnson can say simple. Omar can say loaded, and the audience hears guilty even if nobody says the word. Then the real game begins after the gavel. Because what happens in the room is only half the event. The other half is the translation. Clips get cut down until the question is all that remains, and the explanation is gone. Talking heads argue about patriotism and identity and what an immigrant owes a country, and suddenly we're not even discussing the actual subject anymore. We're discussing the symbolic version of Ilhan Omar, the one who lives in other people's heads. And here's the part that makes this kind of story so combustible. It presses on a nerve that predates Omar and outlives her. America loves immigrants in the abstract, but it interrogates immigrants in the specific. It celebrates the American dream until the dreamer gets power, then it starts asking whether the dreamer is really loyal. That dynamic isn't exclusive to one party either. It just wears different clothes depending on who's holding the microphone. So when Johnson asks that hypothetical war question, it isn't only about one congresswoman, it's about who gets asked to prove belonging in the first place. Omar's allies, in this imagined aftermath, have a dilemma. Defend her too aggressively, and they look like they're ignoring uncomfortable optics. Distance themselves too quickly, and they look like they're abandoning a colleague under pressure. Try to thread the needle, and they sound like politicians, which is never the compliment they think it is. So you get carefully worded statements about process and facts and concerns. the verbal equivalent of wearing gloves to touch a doorknob. And that's when you can tell the fear is spreading, because fear in Washington always shows up as careful grammar. Meanwhile, Johnson's side tries to keep the story narrow and moral. They talk about law, about disclosures, about standards that apply to everyone. And they say it like they've never benefited from selective outrage in their lives. They frame their posture as reluctant duty, which is a classic move, because it lets them look serious, even if they're enjoying the moment. In politics, nobody is ever happy to investigate anyone. They're always concerned, always left with no choice. It's amazing how many careers have been built on Javi. So the country ends up in that familiar place where the loudest voices are the least curious. Peace supporters say, "He Ayabek and America increasingly T." In the days that follow, the war question keeps playing on loop, and the loop starts rewriting everything around it. Every prior speech Omar gave gets reinterpreted through that silence. Every vote becomes suspicious to people who already wanted suspicion. Every defense becomes proof of persecution to people who already wanted persecution. And nobody is really talking about Somalia or policy or diaspora realities anymore. They're talking about a symbol wearing a turquoise hijab under bright lights. That's what the machine does. It turns people into symbols, then punishes them for being symbols. If you want the next beat of this story to stay sharp without turning into a verdict, the move is simple. Keep the narrator honest about what's being alleged versus what's actually established. Let the tension come from the mechanism, how oversight becomes theater, how theater becomes certainty, rather than from declaring anyone a criminal. Ask the questions that make viewers lean forward. Why this question? Why this moment? Why this framing? Why this sequencing? Why these simple hypotheticals that function like traps? And then land the episode where modern politics always lands it. Not on proof, but on the aftershocks. Because the aftershocks are where reputations live or die. A minute of silence becomes a shorthand, and shorthand becomes a brand. And brands are hard to outrun. By the time anyone tries to introduce nuance, the audience has already picked a side and moved on to the next outrage. And the cruelest part is that the clip doesn't just follow Ilhan Omar. It teaches every other immigrant politician, quietly and brutally, that they may someday be asked to prove a kind of loyalty nobody else has to perform on demand. And that lesson doesn't arrive with a memo or a warning label. It arrives the way most political lessons do now, through repetition. It arrives when staffers start quietly advising candidates to avoid certain phrases, certain countries, certain metaphors that might be replayed later without their original meaning. It arrives when consultants add a new line to prep sessions. If they ask where your loyalty lies, answer immediately. No nuance, no history lesson. It arrives when authenticity gets treated as a liability, because authenticity pauses, and pauses look bad on camera. It arrives when survival instincts start masquerading as patriotism. The irony, of course, is that loyalty questions rarely clarify loyalty. They clarify discipline. They test how quickly someone can deliver the expected answer under pressure, not how deeply they've thought about the question itself. They reward the politician who can respond on autopilot and punish the one who tries to explain. In that sense, the hypothetical war question isn't about Somalia or the United States at all. It's about performance under fire. If you slow the tape down and strip away the soundtrack, what you're watching isn't a confession or an indictment. You're watching a clash between two styles of power. On one side, a speaker who understands how hearings can be used to compress complex narratives into binary choices. On the other, a congresswoman whose political identity was built on challenging binaries, on insisting that lived experience doesn't fit neatly into yes or no boxes. That clash was always going to produce sparks. The only question was, who would control the framing when they did? From a distance, it's easy to say Omar should have answered differently. Say, America, move on, deal with the fallout later. That's what most crisis managers would recommend, because crisis managers are paid to minimize damage, not to preserve meaning. But that advice assumes the damage only comes from silence, not from contradiction. It assumes the transcript doesn't exist, that the witnesses won't speak, that the binder won't be opened again. And once you accept those assumptions, you're already writing a different story. There's also a quieter discomfort underneath the whole exchange, one that doesn't get much airtime because it makes everyone uneasy. What does it actually mean to want America to win in a hypothetical war? Win how? At what cost? Under whose leadership? And with what consequences? Most Americans don't ask themselves that question unless they're watching a movie trailer or a campaign ad. They answer reflexively because reflex is safer than reflection. But reflection is exactly what makes politicians vulnerable in moments like this. That vulnerability isn't evenly distributed. A fourth-generation senator from a small Midwestern state doesn't get asked where his loyalty lies when he criticizes foreign policy. A congresswoman who fled a civil war and still speaks with an accent does. That doesn't automatically make the question illegitimate, but it does make the context impossible to ignore. Context doesn't absolve anyone, but it does complicate the story, and complicated stories are harder to sell. So, the machine simplifies. As the hypothetical aftermath rolls on, you can almost see the industry forming around the moment. Think tanks publish essays about dual loyalty without using the phrase out loud. Cable news books, panels titled Patriotism and Public Office, which sounds neutral until you see who's invited. Social media accounts crop the silence into a looping GIF and add captions that say more about the poster than the subject. Fundraisers use the clip to scare donors on both sides. This could happen to your candidate next. Fear, after all, is bipartisan. Meanwhile, Omar's real work as a legislator fades into the background. Bills she sponsored don't trend. Constituent services don't go viral. Committee questions she asks later get filtered through the loyalty lens, as if every policy position is secretly a coded message. This is one of the quietest punishments in politics, being reduced to a single moment that erases everything else. It doesn't require a verdict, only attention. And attention has a way of disciplining behavior beyond its original target. Other members of Congress notice they start preemptively clarifying their allegiance in speeches where it wasn't previously necessary. They add lines like, as Americans and in the national interest, to sentences that used to stand on their own. They stop returning calls from certain community leaders, not because the calls are improper, but because they don't want to explain the optics later. This is how chilling effects work, not through law, but through caution. Johnson, in this narrative arc, doesn't need to keep pressing Omar specifically. The message has already traveled. He can frame the hearing as a necessary, even regrettable exercise in standards. He can insist that anyone else would be treated the same, even if the evidence for that claim is mostly theoretical. He can point to procedure and say, we followed the rules, knowing that rules are often the last refuge of contested legitimacy, and his supporters will repeat it because it sounds fair. Fairness, like patriotism, is powerful when you can say it without defining it. Critics, on the other hand, will argue that the entire exchange was designed to force a public failure rather than uncover truth. They'll point to the sequencing, the optics, the selective release of information. They'll note that loyalty questions are rarely asked of people whose loyalty is assumed. They'll ask why silence is treated as evidence, and why accusation is treated as inquiry, and they won't be entirely wrong, which is why the debate never resolves. Each side is arguing from a different definition of fairness. The problem for Omar isn't just that critics exist, it's that her defenses require time. And time is the one thing modern political storytelling doesn't allow. Explaining diaspora politics takes longer than a clip. Explaining how advocacy intersects with heritage takes longer than a headline. Explaining why silence might be strategic or principled takes longer than a meme. And by the time the explanation arrives, if it arrives at all, the audience has already moved on emotionally. Emotion is always faster than explanation. There's also the question of what accountability should look like in a democracy that runs on spectacle. Oversight is supposed to be boring, procedural, slow. It's supposed to produce reports that nobody reads, and recommendations that get implemented quietly. But boredom doesn't trend, and quiet doesn't mobilize. So oversight becomes content. Content becomes conflict. And conflict becomes currency. At that point, everyone involved is playing a game whether they admit it or not. In this imagined sequence, Johnson understands that game better than most. He knows when to pause, when to rephrase, when to let silence do the work. He knows that asking a question isn't the same as proving a claim, but it can feel the same to an audience. He knows that the most effective accusations are the ones you don't fully articulate. And he knows that if he keeps his tone calm enough, the reaction will look unhinged by comparison. That's not necessarily malice, it's strategy. Omar, conversely, is trapped between two expectations that pull in opposite directions. Her base expects defiance, moral clarity, resistance to what they see as bad faith attacks. The broader electorate expects reassurance, simplicity, and immediate alignment with national symbols. Trying to satisfy both in the same moment is almost impossible. If she answers reflexively, she betrays the complexity her supporters value. If she hesitates, she confirms the suspicion her critics are eager to amplify. And that's where the story stops being about her and starts being about the structure. A structure that rewards certainty over thought, speed over accuracy, and symbolism over substance. A structure that turns hearings into episodes and politicians into characters. A structure that teaches voters to watch politics the way they watch reality TV, waiting for the moment someone cracks. Once you see it that way, the hearing looks less like a search for truth and more like a format. Formats don't care who gets hurt as long as they keep working. In the weeks and months that follow, no single outcome resolves the tension. Even if investigations stall, the question remains. Even if reports are issued, interpretations diverge. Even if Omar survives politically, the loyalty clip follows her like a shadow. And even if she doesn't, the precedent doesn't disappear with her exit. It waits for the next person who fits the profile. That's the part that rarely gets said out loud. Today, it's Ilhan Omar. Tomorrow, it could be someone else with a hyphenated identity, a complicated history, or a foreign policy view that doesn't fit neatly into red, white, and blue packaging. The script is reusable. Change the names, keep the structure, ask the same simple question. Wait for the pause. Once the audience learns how to read the silence, you don't need new evidence. You just need a camera. And so the story ends, not with a verdict, but with a warning disguised as common sense. In American politics, belonging is often conditional, and the conditions can change without notice. Loyalty is assumed for some and audited for others. Questions that sound neutral can carry centuries of baggage. And once a narrative hardens, Walking it back is harder than building it in the first place. If there's a moral here, it isn't about who was right or wrong in that room. It's about how power now operates through framing rather than force. About how silence can be louder than speech and questions sharper than accusations. About how democracy can feel less like deliberation and more like audition. And about how, in the end, the most dangerous part of a hypothetical isn't the answer. It's who gets asked to provide one at all.